So I initially said at the start that when I did her horror episode, Death on the Nile, I figured it would probably just be its own video since it's more or less feature length. But that was before I found a couple of more TV-related things that I honestly didn't think I was going to find, but I surprisingly didn't have to look very far, thankfully. So I figured we'd just do all three of these together. As I said before, there were a couple of things I wanted to find and wasn't able to, like the Strange Case of Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle TV movie or whatever that is, and the Henry VIII miniseries that I can only find the first part of, which is the part she's not in. So this is as close as we're gonna get to just about everything, I think. So we'll just go into these real quick. I want to start with Poirot, obviously, or Agatha Christie's Poirot, I guess it's the full title, but the interesting thing, and I think I may have talked about this when we talked about Branagh's adaptation of Murder on the Orient Express last year, which was, especially with Agatha Christie's works, it's always interesting to think how much the mystery genre is like reinterpreted so many times, and it's like if there's one thing that maybe suffers on people knowing the story already, it would be stories like Agatha Christie stories. Yet they are subject to just so many different versions and interpretations. It's like, so really it comes down to what we always talk about when it comes to remakes or whatever, and it's like it really, especially in these cases, comes down to the execution. Which I guess is kind of contradictory if you take that in both directions. Presentation, we'll say. It all comes down to the presentation of these stories to show what exactly makes them so worthwhile in regards to adapting over and over and over again in potentially different ways with different actors. With different actors does make sense because it's always, if there's one thing that's in all these Christie stories, it's always just the insane array of colorful characters that you can just see all kinds of different actors taking on. So there is some sort of value in it in regards to that also, but also, and like I said, execution is very important, which we'll talk about, starting with actually I guess we pretty much just go right into talking about Blunt, since she's the sort of center factor here. The interesting thing also that I've always loved about Christie's stories is the fact that you especially notice this in the movie adaptations too, is you know that there's a lot of interesting characters in a story when you're looking at like a murder mystery, and almost always one of the more interesting characters in any of these stories is the one that ends up being the dead body. Where you would think this would anytime a character like that would come in where they're just the character that's going to get murdered and the murder has to be solved, you would think not a lot of thought would be put into that character because you would think it wouldn't matter. But in her stories, almost always the person that does end up getting murdered does have a whole lot of interesting things going into that. And so the casting of Blunt really kind of stands out here. I know a lot of people this would probably put this on the lower tier of Blunt's performances. I think it's mainly a criticism of her being miscast. I don't know, because one thing I'm sure stands out immediately is kind of what I was talking about with the Great Buck Howard, where her way of speaking in this particular performance does sort of seem like she's doing that thing I talked about, where it's like, it's almost like she's intentionally exaggerating the accent a little bit. But even so, apart from that, I do think there's a certain feel here, because this is a character, Lynette in particular is a character that is just so easy to screw up, because there are two very easy ways a person can play this part, and that would be either they could just sleepwalk through it, because the character for the most part is just seen as like this sort of rich, beautiful woman that's just kind of has more of a presence than anything else. There's even the moment when she walks into the room and somebody says she certainly knows how to make an entrance, stuff like that. So really, an actress that doesn't really want to go for it that much could just see it as, all I really have to do is just not a whole lot, because this character's just going in a certain direction anyway. But then this is also the kind of character where she's got such that elegant vibe about her, and she's really built up as this, you know, like the loveliest person in the room and the richest and all that. Could play it maybe way too over the top, too. Sort of in the vein of Frances Taylor Thor's performance or something like that, where they could have just sort of copied that. But there is a sort of middle ground that she seems to find here, where especially when we see her in the opening scene when she's first introduced to the her eventual husband, who she takes away from this friend. But the thing is that there seems to be something maybe a bit cold and vain about her, despite the fact that we do get probably the most elegant cocaine snorting on any screen ever. But at the same time, when she sees him, and we do see something where it's when she says, "Isn't this simply lovely?" There is something like almost seems like it's kind of deceitful or something, and there's a sort of lust there, and then we get this immediate jump in time where they're married now, and she's kind of taken on what seems to be a totally different personality, where she now feels like where her guard has been let down now because she's being stalked relentlessly, her and her husband, and you get a sense of this like almost paralyzing fear, like she's like visibly shaken whenever she sees this person now that was basically just barely in her peripheral vision the first time we saw them on screen together. And so I do see where there can maybe be a bit, where people see a bit of unbalance here, but I do think she does make it work for the most part, even though I do think it is probably just the fact that she may be better suited for another character. Like, she'd probably make a better Rosalie or something. But that's pretty much how I feel about that, but I'm fine with it, but I'm sure that's a bias taking hold also. So, on that, as I said, one of the most important things here is meeting all of these different characters, where we've got Allerton and his really creepy relationship with his mother, to the point that when Miss Otterborn's looking at them, she pretty much assumes they're a couple. And her also, I was talking about Dale Thor's performance, and this character is like, not just the character, but also her performance, where it's just like, for me anyway, it's like that sort of classic Christie character. Like, when you think of Agatha Christie characters, this is probably the type of character I would think of first, besides Poirot himself. So it's always great especially for an actress like her, to be able to just really go off with it and be that sort of more over-the-top character with the costumes and the cigarettes and all that. And then we've got, I mentioned that Blondet would have been better suited for, like, Rosalie, but that's not to say that Zoe Telford is not amazing in this part also. That perfect delivery at the beginning with, where she's basically sums up the whole character of Lynette, where she's saying, she's beautiful, she's lovely, she's rich, and then she says, "I don't think I've ever hated anyone so much on first sight." And it's like, this is one of the more standout performances in the whole thing, I think, is her performance. So it's kind of, and I kind of wish she kind of loses prominence as the story goes on, despite the fact that she so clearly sets herself up for a motive. And it's like, and so that is also where you kind of got to get past that thing where it's, these characters are so colorful and individual, but at the same time basically exist just to set themselves up as giant red herrings. So when it feels like there's more to the character than just that, which this character is like a clear case of that, it really does stand out. And then you've also got Daisy Donovan playing Cornelia, and she's another one of those that kind of stands out to me, even though she's not totally prominent, because she's just so animated in her excitement about just being here. And it's like, that also kind of is a good way to sort of play it up. Like, obviously we're going to pretend we're seeing this from the perspective of, we don't know what's going to happen. So when you look at a performance like this, it's sort of like, she's so happy and so animated, you almost think she might be hiding something. So it's kind of nice to kind of keep playing that up also, but she also does it, like, sincerely enough, too, that it really does work. In the way she's just sort of kind of trampled over by her cousin is sort of sad, but even so, that just adds to the character even more. There's even an interestingly cast David Soul here as Bennington, Hutch. So, and obviously a whole other array of cast members here also. So the main thing here, though, that I think really works is, as I talked about before, I tend to be, in certain areas, I tend to be biased against TV. Where I don't take to it near as much as I do movies. So when you get something like this, where it's TV, but it's at feature length and everything, but there's also something that feels really cinematic about it too, by just the way whether it be the way that it's shot or like the production design, the locations, the costume design, all that stuff. There's even like a really effective score in this too, that really makes it work in this way that sort of feels like it goes beyond this being like an episode of TV, which are that's pretty much, I think, the way a lot of people, particularly the fans, approach the Poirot series, where it's basically like individual movies as opposed to a TV series or whatever. And they even get creative with some of the stuff, like the use of flashbacks is really well done, which is something that could be really sloppy if done the wrong way. And I also really like the whole, like just how big the ending is, like that final moment, and the way they actually managed to do the, more or less, the last shot is also the first shot, just kind of in reverse. I think it's really well done also, and really kind of gives the characters something that's... It just kind of gives them something more than we see in adaptations like this, because there's like a precision to the characters that a lot of adaptations like this tend to lack. So I think that really brings it through also. I guess I should mention this is like one of the few episodes I've actually seen. I do know that David Suchet is like widely seen as kind of the ultimate Poirot, like the end-all be-all, because obviously Peter Ustinov did it a couple of times, and there was Albert Finney getting an Oscar nomination for doing it. Most recently, we're having Brainall do it. And all of them are kind of great in their own ways, I think. Like, none of them are really, like, a weak choice, but yeah, I do totally see how he's kind of the one that's seen as, like, kind of the ultimate one. Obviously, he's had the most room to work with it, of course, the most time. But even so, it's... Yeah, but I think another thing here is, like I said, I don't know how much this is in regards to the rest of the series or the rest of the episodes, but this episode seemed to, in particular, have him have this almost vulnerability that makes the character really interesting that we don't typically see in his other adaptations also, so... See, all of this comes together really nicely, and it's this really great adaptation. It's something that sort of, like... And when you're adapting something, it's a good thing to kind of use as a like a reference point of what you should do and maybe shouldn't, especially when you look at, like I said, some of the daunting things that came before it that you have to live up to. Like the adaptation with Peter Ustinov had like Betty Davis and David Niven in it. Lois Chiles from Moonraker played the Bloodsport Lynette. And I think this one, there was a character that was in that one, I'm pretty sure is in the source material also, that they only cut out of this one. Miss Bowers, I think was her name, the one that Maggie Smith played. So yeah, and obviously you also can't really talk about this without talking about the fact that they are adapting it again, to be like, next year, in the next couple of years or something, Branagh doing it as a follow-up to Murder on the Orient Express, where they kind of set it up at the end there. With Gal Gadot playing Lynette. I know you're not supposed to, like, you know, pit actors and actresses against each other and everything, but it's like, we'll see. We'll see what happens when you... but, yeah, so, and I think Armie Hammer is playing the husband, and I think that might be all they've cast so far. That'll be interesting to see how that cast list builds. So yeah, that's how I feel about this. So, really, really good stuff, of course. So I wanted to talk about Empire, a miniseries that's set in that Julius Caesar era, shortly after he's killed, and pretty much all the aftermath of that. Much like Warrior Queen, this is something that I really don't think I would have ever watched if I wasn't doing this. So it kind of felt more like, at the start there anyway, it felt more like something that, like, we would have watched in school or something. Like, in 10th grade in history class, we watched that Nero miniseries. And it was like, I was kind of getting a very similar vibe of that. But that's not to say this didn't kind of grow on me about, like, halfway through, interestingly enough, because, as I was saying also, before, this is, like, doing something this big and TV-wise, because this is obviously, you know, pre-Game of Thrones, so it's like, this was before, you know, we really saw, like, massive, massive budgets at work, on TV and stuff like that. So, regardless of that, though, this is still, like, a pretty big-ass production. And so it starts, and we've got this, after we've gotten this whole sort of epic setup, we've got blunt narrating. She narrates like the start of every new episode and kind of takes us back into it. And it does have like the narration itself does have like this sort of mythic, angelic quality and all that, where she's the Vestal Virgin that can basically see everything, and and we meet her pretty much immediately. And the one thing that kind of stood out at first here was that, once again, we're like really early in our work now, but there was something sort of oddly modern about her, like at the start, really just in this scene, even like through this whole thing, and she's got a lot of screen time. It's really only this scene that kind of feels a bit odd. I don't know if I was just getting used to it or what, but it's like I said, there was something weirdly sort of modern feel to it. Like, I guess the way she was speaking, like the way she says, like, "Sorry, I must go," or when he's saying, he's asking her when he'll know the answers to what it is he wants to know, and when she answers him, it's almost like the only thing missing at the end of her sentence is "duh." But I do wonder if that has to do with because it would be weird if something this massive was. I would seriously doubt it was shot in order or anything, but it wouldn't necessarily be hard to believe to think that this might be her first day on set. I do remember her saying something quite recently that one of her problems has always been that there's nothing she dreads more than the first day on the set, and that's usually when she's kind of shaky at first, but then she gets her groove. Given that knowledge, I wouldn't be surprised if this was the first day, but once it does go on, though, we do have her character becomes progressively more crucial. Actually, not progressively, almost immediately, because she's the one that kind of sees what's going to happen to Caesar, and she tries to warn everybody, and of course they don't listen to her, and we know what happens. Colin Feore is playing Caesar, which is interesting because in this, big, long miniseries, he's killed about halfway through the first episode. And it's like, I remember back in the day, I thought that Rex Harrison being killed halfway through a 4.5-hour movie, or however it was shockingly soon, but this even more so. But obviously we know this is going to set off everything, particularly when Octavius is given the whole prophecy and all that. So, and once we go from there, there is something, I guess I can talk about her real quick before we go further into the story, but there is definitely something here where she does have this certain presence. Like I said, after that first scene, when I kind of have gotten into the flow of it now, it does almost seem like she has this otherworldly way about her. Like when you look at all the other characters, and then whenever she comes into it, it's almost like we're just kind of dealing with something else entirely. Especially when it's a character that's like the only character that can see what's going to happen and all that. But also throughout, the way that she has to, because they obviously set her up as, this virginal character, and it's just like, my job is to watch the flame, and that's all I do. But there is a lot more that she gets to do throughout. Like, there are many cases where she gets to, like, really stand her ground and, like, make her own choices regardless of the risk that might cause. But there's even the moments where she's, like, just, like, really unaffected and unafraid of these dudes that are, like, much bigger than her, trying to intimidate her, but she just almost seems totally unfazed. But that's not to say that there's not a vulnerability. There absolutely definitely is. Where you still kind of want her protected, even though we've seen how she's able to stand up to people, especially in moments when they say, like, we're going to bury you up to your neck and stone you to death and stuff like that. There is still something, like, tough about her also. And not only that, though, but there's also, eventually, love is going to be brought into this story, pretty much through her. And there's something really effective about the way that happens, too, because usually this is the case where, like, when I'm watching anything, especially something like this, it would be like the last thing this needs is some sort of love thing shoehorned into it. But there's something sort of so sincere that just really gives this movie like an emotional core, series, whatever, an emotional core that you really wouldn't expect in something like this, that actually is there for a reason and not just sort of, to have it there, like a lot of cases. So, and the other thing I think also is, when I was saying how it kind of fit weird to me at first, it is one of those cases where this may have some actors that are, like, maybe too recognizable to the point that they look out of place. Like Dennis Haysbert, for instance, who is a really solid actor, comes in for like a couple of scenes, and it almost feels like his deliveries or something feel like they're out of a school play or something, and it's like it doesn't feel like it's him. It just feels like maybe he's too recognizable and it seems too out of place. But because every now and then they do throw in actors you might recognize, like the guy that plays the Saint of Killers, for instance, on Preacher is in there, or Fiona Shaw comes in about halfway through. And so in some cases, if they're not too recognizable, they fit in pretty nicely. But in some cases it can work, though. Like in Blunt's case, for instance, she eventually works her way into it and does feel very much a part of it. But I do think it's kind of intentional that it feels sort of like she feels sort of different than the other characters, given what she's got going on. I did find myself, like, it was probably the first half or so where I was having trouble getting into it, and I sort of was just kind of kept waiting for her to come back, and it was like anytime we went to the Vestal Temple was exciting to me, which is weird. And we knew this because we get, like, the locations at the bottom throughout that tell us where we are and all that. And even down to, like, Copy Room, which by then kind of starts feeling a little ridiculous, but even so. But I do think in something this long, in a genre that I don't really care for to begin with, it's kind of bound to happen that my interest would go in and out. But the thing here, though, is, like I said, it actually did start to grow on me about halfway through, and the characters kind of became more... And I don't know if it was necessarily that I started getting more involved, or if it's... Like, it almost started to feel like the acting started to get better, weirdly enough. Like I was talking about before, where it's like, surely they did not shoot this in order, but I'm almost positive the performances got better as it went, weirdly enough. Because for a while there it is, like, the actors and the personalities are, like, sort of too bland and neutral and just sort of something, you know, the most vague outline of what you'd expect from something like this kind of material. It's also got, like, I also kind of wanted it to start going, like, because obviously they're already, you know, taking some liberties with the material here, so it's like, why not just go for it then? Because this has, like, a lot of bad guys in it, too, that come and go. And I started finding myself getting to the point where I was, like, begging it to just really go for it. It was like, these bad guys need to go, like, full Walking Phoenix and Gladiator right now. Like, and they just kind of all feel like they're all kind of in the same blank space. Which kind of adds to what I feel is kind of the routine, you know, nature of the subject matter and all that. But even so... and there is, like, a decent line here and there, like the whole, you know, denounce Octavius or I'll make this temple shake and stuff like that. There's the really good scene. I think it was the scene that finally won me over as far as Octavius as the main character, where it was when he's with that dude and the dude, like, is kind of starting to figure out who he is. And then it's like, he says, you know, is that your scary face? Don't bother. And then Octavius just beats his ass to death. And it's like, from then on, it was like, okay, I can get on board with this now. And then, and like I said, the cast does seem to get better as it goes, particularly the main players. The guy playing Octavius, the guy playing Mark Antony. It just kind of, like I said, maybe I just started to get more invested in it as it went, and it got better, like, in that way, but... I don't know, I could still swear that something changed along the way. And like I said, as far as it, you know, feeling like this big epic, we do have sometimes these epic shots, like when the camera will, like, go up over the gates and we see, like, all the fire and stuff like that, feels, like, genuinely catastrophic. And then, like I was talking about the emotion that Blunt brings into it. There's also the kind of side plot going on with Tyrannus, especially the scene where he's, like, looking at his children and stuff like that, and it's, yeah, and there's the moment towards the end there also when they're getting ready for, like, the big final battle, and they, like, come together for that one last time they talk about. It really did start to get really easy to get invested in it the more it went. Like I said, I don't know if I can chalk that up to a slow start, or if it just eventually won me over, I don't know, but, I mean, it does end up going in other places also, like the age-old, the girl gets taken trope, like how this isn't going to end unless Blunt gets taken and she has to be saved and all that. That does bring, like, probably the most emotional moment in the entire thing when they're both behind the bars and she's, like, reaching out, and it's just heart-shattering when he has to basically say, you know, I can't do this or whatever. And that's... So... Yeah, so like I said though, this probably would have been something I probably wasn't into at all if not for the presence of Blunt and all that, who can just obviously she can pretty much make just about anything worth caring about. But even despite that, I was kind of surprised how much I did eventually get into it. So especially with how much I just really wasn't feeling it at the start, but I eventually got there and it's fine. So it's probably more of a guilty pleasure thing than anything else. But even so, that's still a good thing. So that's pretty much how I felt about that. It's a pretty big time investment for me to only take that away from it, but it's fine. And lastly, real quick, I want to talk about Foyle's War, which is admittedly, to my understanding, this is like an immensely popular show, especially in the UK and all that, which seems to have quite a few important things to say about history, particularly Britain's history in regards to the war, but at the same time, I must admit that this is actually a show I had not heard of prior to me researching all this. So I did my best to research it before I went into it because I knew that I was going to be just watching one episode in the midst of a whole series, which seems totally illogical, but to my understanding, it was created by a guy named Anthony Horowitz, who wrote just about all the episodes, I think, or co-wrote them. And there were 8 series, like seasons, and which had like 3 or 4 episodes per one, and then which amounted to like 28 episodes over the span of like 13 years, from 2002 to 2015. There was like a cancellation and a revival in there, like somewhere around, like the cancellation was somewhere around 2008, and then the revival came back around 2010. But there were already kind of gaps anyway from the way it was all spread out. But even so, but I was very relieved to learn that despite the fact that I was watching it like right in the middle here, like this one's in the middle of series 2, I did learn that the more or less the episodes work standalone, which was going to really help. There are occasional strands, and there were characters that I could tell were significantly more important probably if I had known who they were previously. But even so, I was able to get something out of this. This was the 3rd episode, I think, of the 2nd series, called War Games. And it's each one is apparently very specific on the time period that it's set in. This one is October 1940. And the interesting setup here is that we have 3... It's sort of similar what we were talking about with Death on the Nile. It does kind of have a very similar feel of that sort of mystery following this detective sort of thing. Just going through these various different ones, but what we set up here, there seems to be 3 different, seemingly unrelated things that they set up here. Starting with this business meeting that ends with a secretary being thrown out of a window and killed, then this brother and sister farmer who are pretty much stuck in this horrible broke position, and then eventually, somehow this is going to involve these war games that are taking place that Foyle, our main character, is the referee of, despite the fact that he's usually this detective that's looking at these sort of war-era crimes, and that's what the series is, basically. And this, obviously, to talk about the Blunt thing real quick, there is... These two, the brother and the sister, are kind of the... sort of where it all kind of feels like it branches out and then eventually comes back to... with the way because they do seem a bit minor when we meet them, like they'll be kind of insignificant in the long run, but no, not so much. So when we meet them, we kind of see them in this position of pretty much no matter what they do, whatever decision they make in their lives is potentially deadly, because they're in this horrible place with like the banks, and then they've got the whole, if they continue to farm, they might die of pneumonia like their dad did, or he can go back to his life of crime, and God knows what will happen. We will certainly find out. And so, when we see her, it does sort of seem like she's almost the... It took me a second to... If they mentioned it right away, I sort of missed it, because there was a point in time there, briefly, where I had assumed they were husband and wife, and she sort of came off as this sort of, like the of-the-era wife type, where it's the whole... He's doing all this, and she's just kind of... She's there, obviously, doing the work with the bees and all the other stuff that she does, but they kind of give you that vibe of she's like that sort of housewife stereotype. But no, number one, she's a sister. And secondly, there is much more to her than that. Particularly in this scene, where the scenes where we see that, like, she can be equally frail and tough, like when she's treating his wounds, but the way she tells him to, like, sit down and says that she's also emotional, but then she also can turn around and say, like, I will completely throw your ass out if we get, you know, too deep in criminal shit. And then the way they sort of build this up, that how in her defense of her brother, there seems to be this sort of looming inevitable confrontation she's going to have with Foyle, that we do eventually get. And when that comes, she's just so incredibly good. So we talked about Warrior Queen, we're going to talk about My Summer of Love and all that, and all these different things that are widely considered her first thing. Another source says that this absolutely is her very first credit, even before Warrior Queen. Chronologically, I don't know. I don't even know if it matters. But the point is that even this early in her career, this is something you can definitely see a star in the making in this role. And I love that she sort of, because there were times where I kept thinking that the story was just going to kind of move on, and we had left those characters behind, and it was going to go from here. And the way she kind of kept having to come back into it was very pleasing. So, especially in this moment when she's interrogated by Lawrence Fox, who's basically our, you know, formidable villain here, and it's who, for the longest time, I knew from The Hole with Keira Knightley and Thora Birch, and I just called Discount Paul Bettany, who is, like, perfectly cast in this role, particularly in the directions this character ends up going and the ties that we end up learning that he has. And so those scenes are really strong also, and the way that character too, also the way they kind of set off like he's just this sort of business guy that's in this business mainly from, like, nepotism or whatever, but then as it goes on, and the more kind of a threat we see that he is as it goes on, it does kind of, you know, maybe dampen the mystery angle of it a little bit, but even so, I do like what's going on there. But then you look at all this, and this is another case, basically what I was talking about with Death on the Nile, where the British TV shows really seem to have something here in regards to the feature-length episodes, despite being a series. And the way they just really go all out, where, much like Death on the Nile, this has, like, you know, great production design and great costumes. There's also, the dialogue is really clever also, and it's clever, and it's got that sort of sophistication to it, especially when characters are, like, getting burned. Like that exchange with, what was his name? Walker is the Lawrence Fox's dad, who's, like, the main dude. That confrontation that he has with his wife on the stairway is really well written. And there's also just kind of the way it paces itself, too. Because, like I said, it is feature-length, but we don't really get, like, the major turning point for this story till about halfway through. But just the way it just gradually unravels itself still feels so natural. Like, it's when we reach that moment in the middle where everything has the turning point, it's kind of like you didn't even realize we hadn't really reached the turning point yet, because it just unfolds itself so nicely and so naturally, which is really nice. They're really taking advantage of that feature length that they have. So that, and of course, at the head of this is Michael Cushing as the title character, Foyle, he's definitely got a nice subtlety to him, because with this kind of character in this kind of series, you would think maybe he'd be it'd be like kind of a showy role, like a Poirot, for instance. But no, he's incredibly subtle, and really the big moments for him come in just, like, one line reading or one delivery or something. Like probably one of the best moments in the whole episode is when he figures something out, and he's gradually letting the person know that he knows what's up. So he says, how can I let you leave? But it's just like he's saying it in any casual conversation, and just kind of reveals that he knows everything. Or the final conversation with Walker, where it's like, it's not much of a day for you, is it? Just little lines like that are all it really takes from an actor that can deliver them like that, and it's like those are his big moments. But it doesn't have to be a showy performance, which is really great. And there's a lot of supporting players, obviously, some that obviously come from before, like his driver, who's like his sort of loyal companion in this work also, who is played by an actress memorably named Honeysuckle Weeks. And so so yeah, you look at this and it's I can do see like I do see like the character like Devlin, for instance, where it's like characters that I can feel probably would have their presence probably would have had much more of an impact, and the story would have had more impact with them in it if I was more aware of what had come before and not just this episode by itself. But I still like how standalone it was, to the point that I could tell what I had missed and was kind of able to put it together at least a little bit. I'm sure if I were to start from the beginning and then get to here, this would be an entirely different sort of episode. But and this is something that I do have a bit of interest possibly going back and sort of seeing all the way through, especially since there's only 28 episodes in the whole thing. And I'd also heard that like when it got into the later episodes, it was like a different era where like he was retired and all that. So it does all sound very interesting to me, and like I said, just the way it sort of shows like Britain during the war and how that's certain aspects of it where it's not always fully acknowledged, despite the fact how there's just so much media surrounding this era, and that's something that sort of seems to be something we don't see as much. So yeah, and apparently this also the Hilda character, I guess, was introduced in this one, but would actually go on to be like a main character later in the series. So it does seem like an interesting sort of a turning point here, but I am a bit interested to see what came before and what comes after. So perhaps eventually I will do that. But in the meantime, I think that's where I'm going to end this. So we only have two more left. We have what she considers her first movie and what is her most recent movie. And we'll see what she's getting all those nominations for, even though I'm sure we already know. So until all of that, that's it for this.